Better late than never, or too little too late? It took a little over a month of haggling for the European Union to agree on a Russian oil embargo, one that offers an exemption for holdouts like Hungary. How big or how small a caveat? After all, the EU does reduce dependency on Russian oil by 90%. In the long run, it's further incentive to accelerate the continent's move away from fossil fuels. In the immediate, that won't stop Moscow's march on the Donbass, where it's flattening entire cities to achieve its aims. Will the West waver there too? The United States announcing it won't supply Ukraine with long-range weapons that can strike inside of Russia. We'll ask about the timing of that announcement, the message it sends to the Kremlin, a calibrated response that strikes the balance between defending against the invasion of sovereign states on NATO's doorsteps and, well, the fear of needlessly provoking a nuclear-armed Russia. Could it also be a sign that with inflation spiraling at home, it's gone up again in Europe, the West may start to experience Ukraine fatigue? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking if sanctions work. Joining us from Brussels, he's just been covering that marathon summit, France 24 correspondent Dave Keating. How are you?
Doing good, Francois.
With us as well, French Socialist Senator Hélène Conway-Mouret, who sits on the upper chambers Foreign Affairs, Defense and Armed Forces Committee, and just back from Vilnius, you said. Thank you for being with us. Thierry Brosse, professor at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Good evening.
Good evening.
And joining us from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, Peter Zalmayev, director of the Eurasian Democracy Initiative. Thanks for being with us.
Greetings.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Took a month, but in the end, EU leaders finally agreed to it, to cut around 90% of all Russian imports of oil, and this over the next 6 months.
I do see in our discussions the fact that both sanctions and military support to Ukraine do impact Russian war and Russian effort. First, because this is a big solidarity package towards Ukraine. This is how Ukraine did resist during the past few weeks. First, thanks to their bravery, but because we sent this equipment and so on. And third, because yes, there is an economic impact on the Russian economy and the ability of Russia to finance this war.
So do sanctions work? Let's dive right into it. Thierry Brosse, will they work, these sanctions?
Well, they already started to work when you look at the amount of money the Russians are getting from their oil. They were exporting $4.7 million per day, so $470 million per day they were receiving. But interestingly enough, this was reduced, those volumes were reduced because international oil companies have decided, forced by their shareholders, to reduce this. And they've all stated that by the year end, they were not going to get any Russian oil and oil product.
We saw for the month of May, though, that number of barrels exported starting to trickle up again. Do you get the sense that the oil industry is realizing where they can play fast and loose?
Well, no, perhaps it's just a seasonal element, but I think the trend is down, and the trend was going to be down. And at the end of the day, with or without those sanctions, Russia was going to get $200 million less per day from the oil they were selling in Europe, and they will perhaps reroute to Asia. But interestingly enough, those sanctions for me the political level is not doing much because this was nearly done by the industry. Proviso what you said about the risk of the industry willing to increase their volumes.
Hélène Conway-Mouret, we heard thanks from the Ukrainian president, but then he also complained, saying this is 50 to 60. This could have come 50 to 60 days earlier. Your thoughts?
Well, yes, of course. I suppose, you see, if we were in his place, we would possibly say the same. Ukraine has been crying out for help. But at the same time, I think the EU has moved quite rapidly, maybe on the basis of the various crises it had had to deal with before, with Brexit, then the pandemic, and now this. I think we just showed that for the first time the decision-making process could be speeded up, and it was indeed, because it is a package. It's not just one country, imposing a sanction or it's the whole of the continent. So I think the impact can be, of course, greater. And the impact, of course, on ourselves is also not negligible. I think we have to maybe, convey the fact that we are doing our best as well. I mean, I met some Ukrainian delegations in Vilnius just 2 days ago. And yes, they were asking us for more arms, for more help, for more everything. And, I did convey that in terms of military equipment, we were doing our best. And, but France, I think, strength relies in its diplomacy. So we do have to play on all fronts.
It's pain for ordinary citizens. I mean,
it is indeed.
Having an oil embargo means that prices at the pump will go up. Do you feel as though your constituents get it?
Well, yes, because I think the war in Ukraine, he's very present in the media. And, solidarity was expressed by everybody. And we've seen families, receiving Ukrainian families in their homes, even though they were told that it may not be for a few weeks, but a few months or even longer. So people are prepared to make sacrifices, in this. But at the same time, the impact is very big. And now, we're starting to see that it's not going to stop rapidly. I mean, we were all hoping for a short war, and we have more and more signs that it may be a fairly long one. So, there may be a tiredness and a fatigue at some point. So we just have to to keep informing people properly as to what is happening and why decisions are made.
Yeah. What's the takeaway for you, Dave Keating? Is it that kind of a fear of there being Ukraine fatigue as described by the center, because we are bracing now for a long war? Or is it the fact that in the end, the EU managed to overcome the misgivings of some, or should I say one, Hungary's Viktor Orban?
Yeah, this was really one assisted by two others. The real block here was Viktor Orban, and for the past weeks we've known the minute that Viktor Orban said yes, this was going to get passed. I know he's been also joined by Czechia and Slovakia here and also being essentially exempt from this. But Czechia and Slovakia were not the driving force here. It was him. And what really got them over the line here was this compromise idea to exempt the pipeline Russian oil imports. So this ban is only applying to imports by sea. But I think it's important to point out that at first glance, it might seem like, well, that's not very much because it's just 2/3 of Russian oil imports that come by sea. That leaves 1/3. But Germany and Poland have voluntarily agreed to not use this exemption. They are going to phase out all oil, pipeline and sea, at the same time as everyone else by the end of this year. So that just leaves 10% of Russian oil imports that will remain, that will go via pipeline to Hungary, Czechia, and Slovakia. This is undoubtedly a victory for Viktor Orban, but I don't think it could be characterized as a defeat for the EU because 10% left isn't actually very much.
Yeah, Viktor Orban certainly treating it as a win when he posted to Facebook overnight after that agreement was reached.
It would have been unbearable for us to operate the Hungarian economy with more expensive non-Russian oil. This would have amounted to an atomic bomb, but we have managed to avoid that. We managed to make a deal that says that those countries which receive oil via the Druzhba pipeline can continue their business under the old conditions. Families can sleep calmly tonight. We managed to fend off the most incredible proposal.
It would have been an atomic bomb, Dave Keating?
I mean, it would have had a significant impact. We've heard sympathy from other EU leaders, even EU leaders that are not normally aligned with Viktor Orban. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, certainly no friend of Viktor Orban, told journalists as he was leaving last night that he understands Hungary's position and that, the Netherlands is not very dependent on Russian oil, but Hungary is, and so they have to understand that different countries are in different positions. There's no doubt that this would have had a big impact on the Hungarian economy, but other countries that this is going to have a big impact on are willing to face that. It's actually going to have a bigger economic impact on Poland. Poland is more dependent on Russian oil, but Poland's willing to do this. And we've heard from Poles over the past days that Poland just sees the geopolitical goals here as being more important than any kind of economic pain. We heard that exact sentiment from the Latvian Prime Minister yesterday. And so it really is just about a difference in attitude here. Viktor Orban is kind of the lone man out in how he views this war. He does not view this war in the same way as the 27 other leaders of the European Union. He is everything he does and says shows sympathy for Russia's position and a refusal to have Hungary bear any kind of sacrifice for the Ukrainians. He has gone along with sanctions so far, up until this point with the Russian oil embargo, but he has continually, especially since after the election, said that Hungary should stay out of the war, that Hungarians should not bear any cost for this war, and that's really what his actions during this Russian oil embargo negotiation for several weeks really showed.
Yeah, Hungary getting more than half its crude oil from Russia, but again, as Dave is saying, it's a drop in the barrel compared to the volume of imports from the likes of Poland and Germany. Peter Zamayev, I know Ukrainians feel as though Germany could be doing more to support Ukraine after this agreement. Will public opinion be more sympathetic to Germans who are taking a hit with this?
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. There's a little bit of a displeasure, to say the least, with Germany's indecision over the last few weeks and months after having said all the right things. Having promised the deliveries of weapons, Germany's been very reluctant to follow suit, and there's been a little bit of a misunderstanding between the two countries, needless to say, even though Germany, once again, it has to be noted, just approved $1 billion in aid to Ukraine. That's pretty significant. And obviously, this would not have been possible, the oil embargo, without Germany's direct intercession. But once again, folks, we are discussing the merits of this sanctions policy, and it's a very correct policy to follow from the moral standpoint, but from the efficacy standpoint, I don't need to remind our viewers that sanctions generally have had a very poor track record throughout history in correcting bad behavior. It is more than clear to us here in Ukraine and hopefully to our partners that the only way to persuade Vladimir Putin to change his ways is through military success. And that's why Ukraine is agitating for speedier deliveries of weapons. By all accounts, the Russian economy is suffering, but it is not clear that Russians will be motivated, to turn on their leaders just because they're not, able to access McDonald's, and other Western brands. It seems like Russians are, have been fed a steady diet of propaganda where they will be probably just going along with the privations that they're facing. And once again, it's only through a victory on the battlefields that Ukraine will be able to restore the status quo to at least, the pre-February 24th borders.
Yeah, because there's of course the possible boomerang effect. What with when the price of oil, if the price of oil goes up, Russia could benefit from it. We can crunch the numbers in a moment, perhaps with Thierry Brosse. But I just want to read to you, Peter, a reaction on Telegram by Russia's former president, Dmitry Medvedev. And he says, "They hate us all!" ! The basis for these decisions is hatred for Russia, for Russians, and for all its inhabitants. How much political capital does Russia gain from being under embargo?
Well, first of all, Mr. Medvedev is a very questionable kind of spokesman. He is trying his best to look macho, even though he's a very emasculated leader, and he's also said to be an alcoholic. That is actually a well-known fact. But it seems like Putin's aides are at pains to show themselves as the biggest hawks. It seems like there may already be some kind of a power struggle afoot in case the leadership decides that Vladimir Putin may need to step down. We just don't know what goes on behind these Byzantine, doors of Russian power. But yes, so far Russians have been able to sort of, to rally the public around the idea of Russia as a besieged fortress. Once again, what's helped them is a very simple fact that they've cracked down on all independent media. They've closed down Instagram and Facebook. They are actually considering, as we speak, closing down YouTube. That may also be a reality. The question is how long they'll be able to do that. You know, you can lie to some people some of the time, you can lie to all people some of the time, but you cannot lie to all people all the time. I think that dictum, even in the case of Russia, remains true.
All right, and we saw how much of a heavy lift the sixth wave of EU sanctions was. Don't expect the seventh one to include imports of Russian natural gas. That's the words of the Estonian Prime Minister. She spoke to reporters at that EU summit, saying effectively, now comes the hard part.
Gas is, of course, much more difficult than oil already was. All the next sanctions will be more difficult because so far they have only hurt Russians, but now they're also having effects on Europeans, and that's why it's much more politically difficult to decide those things.
Is that true, Thierry Brosse?
Yes, I think she's absolutely right. I mean, it was easy to get this embargo. It's going to be much more difficult to get the gas one. Plus also, remember that who's going to lead the European Union from 1st of July? It's going to be the Czech Republic. That was on the other side behind Orban. So it's going to be much more difficult. It's going to be much more difficult also because there will be this Ukraine fatigue, but there will be also this energy transition fatigue. I mean, we are seeing price higher and higher. And I've been here saying that the energy crisis was going to last, but people may not like this idea. I mean, they were thinking that, yes, we are going to pay a little bit higher, but then it will revert. But we are not going to see this reversion to lower prices sooner. And so therefore, political leader will be very, very stressed in trying to put a gas embargo. Interestingly enough, on the other side, what we can say is Gazprom is doing our job. Gazprom is cutting more and more countries.
Yeah, there's the Netherlands today. Tomorrow's Denmark.
Yes, and there is another country, another company in Germany tomorrow. So, I mean, Gazprom has reduced their export to Europe by 40%. And we've managed to do without it slightly higher prices, but not prices at the record that we've seen back at the end of last year, because we are able now to manage with more liquefied natural gas coming into Europe. So we are in a position to do this. And perhaps at the end of the day, we will be able to really reduce completely our Russian import, thanks, I would say, quote unquote, to Gazprom cutting one by one all the countries. And perhaps what we all know is that the systemic risk is with Germany. So hopefully they will cut Germany the last. And so therefore we will have time to adapt. But I think so far, half of the job, 40% of the job has been done by the Russians themselves.
The Russians themselves. The Russians, by the way, who are claiming Rosneft, the oil giant, claiming that it's reopening oil fields. Is that just public relations, or are they finding more export markets?
Well, I think, first of all, one of the sanctions that does work and that we haven't talked about is the fact that we do not provide technology any longer to Russia. And so therefore, what you are seeing is Russian production in oil has decreased by 10%, thanks to our own sanctions, thanks to the fact that we are not allowed to ship technology into Russia any longer. So sanctions are working in this way. I mean,
how long though? How long does it take for those to really cripple the oil and gas sector?
I mean, a gas and oil field is declining by 10% per annum if you don't do any investment or if you don't have the right technology. So we've seen already this in less than 6 months, this 10% happening. And so if the service company are not there, we could see further reduction. I'm not saying we are going to see 1 million per day drop every 6 months, but again, we are already seeing this, and this is hurting Russia. So I don't think they are opening new fields right now.
All right, that's in the long run. Right now, Russia, though, has the momentum on the battlefield. It's destroying the eastern city of Severodonetsk block by block. That's according to the mayor of that eastern Ukrainian city, a city that was home to 100,000 before the latest fighting. And here in France, emotions running high after the death of a second French journalist covering the war. 34-year-old Frédéric Leclerc-Imhoff was reporting on evacuations from Severodonetsk for BFM TV when the armed vehicle he was traveling in was shelled.
A double crime was committed. An evacuation convoy was targeted and a journalist was killed, both civilians and a journalist.
Hélène Conway-Mouret, we were talking about being wary of Ukraine fatigue setting in. The death of this journalist has put Ukraine back on the front headline today in all the radio stations, newspapers here in France. Is that going to galvanize French public opinion at this point?
I think we never stopped talking about Ukraine. What it has done somehow is just to show the courage of these journalists, and that's just one example of somebody dying tragically. And but many of his colleagues have died, and we forget how much courage it takes and the job that they do on the ground for us to get the best information away from the propaganda that we can indeed get also via social networks and other ways that are not controlled. So galvanized, I'm not sure, but yes, I think we are today in a position where we have to make, I think, political decisions that were not made in the past, like investing massively, for instance, in renewable energies. We haven't done that at the speed that we should have worked. And what this war is showing is the dependency that we have on Russia that nobody knew about. We woke up with the pandemic as to the dependency we had vis-a-vis China, in many ways. And now I think we're all waking up to this world where we have decided a long time ago to deindustrialize or, well...
Decarbonize.
To cut back on our industries and to become kind of service countries.
Oh, I see.
Okay? And thinking that production could be done cheaper and better somewhere else, and everything was going to be shipped and so on. And now today we see that when there is a problem with the price of crude oil or when there is a shortage of it, that those ships are not going to be coming anymore to Europe, and we won't get, the cereals, the food, the whatever, the oil, the energy that we are used to getting kind of freely and easily. And in Africa, it is becoming a very big problem. I mean, I was in Africa just a few weeks ago, and I was told by Air France that my plane may not be able to take off because of the lack of kerosene, that they did not know if there was going to be a supply for the plane. So it's impacting everything in everyday life. I know we don't have to get on a plane every day, but, if the plane doesn't take off, it's all the freight also that is carried in that plane that is not being transported. And then there is a shortage of fruit, vegetables, whatever. So I think we are at a turning point. And I think courageous decisions will have to be made now. And if they are not made, well, we're going to be paying a high price. And I think public opinion is prepared to make sacrifices, but it is also prepared, I think, to move on and maybe invest in what the 21st century should tell us in terms of relationship and sharing of whatever the natural goods that we have.
Dave Keating, of course, that was a big part of that EU summit. They were on the official agenda was this plan to accelerate the energy transition of the bloc.
Yeah, I mean, this is this Repower EU group of proposals that just came out earlier this month. I mean, the big headline focus now has become getting off of Russian energy, but this is really about getting off of all fossil fuels. The thing is, though, is that in the short term, this is actually about increasing fossil fuels. This is about increasing alternative fossil fuels, building new infrastructure to get gas from different sources in liquefied form, liquefied natural gas. It's finding new oil suppliers. And of course, the concern is that in these couple years of this urgent need to be building all of this new fossil fuel infrastructure, the EU is actually locking in this infrastructure that lasts for decades, and that it's going to miss the climate targets that it's set for 2030 and 2050 because of this bonanza of pipeline building that we're going to have over the next couple years. Environmental advocates, climate campaigners have said this isn't necessary and it's not the smartest thing that could be done. Actually, you could have a big energy efficiency drive. You could build renewable installations faster than you can build LNG import terminals or the infrastructure needed to supply them. But I think people are too nervous to try that, and they want to, at the moment, stick with what they know, which is fossil fuels. So I think the conversation yesterday and extending a bit today was really focused on these short-term measures of replacing Russian fossil fuel with other fossil fuel, which could actually do great damage to the EU's climate goals.
Thierry Brosse, you agree?
Yes, I think we are even going to replace some of this gas or some of this oil by coal, which is even worse. But I think we are also in this position, as Madame Lassanesi stated. I mean, we have to look at diversification of supply. I mean, it's easier for us to move away from Russian oil because we were only 25% dependent on Russian oil. It's going to be much more difficult because of gas, because we are 40% dependent on gas. On the Repower EU targets, I think they need to be pragmatism. So yes, we will need more gas, we will need more oil. But I also think that one of the things missing in the Repower EU paper, which you address, is the fact that we need to say to our people that you need to consume less. And interestingly enough, what we've seen IEA, International Energy Agency, stating you need to reduce speed on motorway, which is not very popular. You need to ban cars from cities 1 weekend out of 2, etc., etc. In the Repower EU paper, the Commission says those are very good measures. Let's put the member states to do the work and put this propaganda to their people. I use propaganda here to show how important this is. But interesting enough, those are not very measures that voters would like. So this is a problem. We need to tell people that this energy crisis is going to stay for longer, that prices are going to stay higher. It's going to be first higher fossil fuel prices, and then it's going to be higher decarbonized fuel. But we need also to get this energy efficiency as fast as possible. And please keep in mind that every molecule or every electron that we do not consume today, we are in a power to put it in storage as a molecule for next winter. And remember, the power of Vladimir Putin increases when we arrive closer to winter.
And of course, Peter Zalmay, if this conversation concerns you, what with Ukraine now hooked up to Europe's electricity grid?
Oh, right, absolutely. Ukraine has been, Ukraine has actually had a very, tough kind of task and all this time. You keep in mind the absurd situation that Russia has been pumping its gas to Europe, to European markets, using Ukraine's pipelines that go through Ukraine's territories. So you have to give the Ukrainian government credit for protecting this pipeline. It would have been, it is a very obvious target for Ukrainians who would like to, damage, Russia's economic prospects. So far, the gas keeps flowing. But what you said about electricity, so far we have the city of Rivne in closer to the western part of Ukraine that has been experimenting with, this new format of being, connected to the European electricity grid. And the sooner the rest of the country follows suit, the better. We need to cut this umbilical cord that connects us with the Russian Federation in many areas, not just this, but the very transport, the railways. Part of the snag that we're facing with this grain, supplies of grain that have been languishing in the port of Odessa, why we cannot reroute it using land over to Europe is because of the different gauge of our rails, which is a legacy of the Russian Empire. This should have been done a long time ago, but I guess we will have to get cranking and start doing this pretty soon after our victory.
After your victory, let's talk about that export of grain. You heard Senator Conway Mouret earlier talking about how the events of the last year have helped us rethink when it comes to supply chains. Well, the prospect of a long war means alternate routes out, as you were saying, for Ukrainian goods blocked from exiting via the Black Sea. That can mean via Romanian and Bulgarian ports, but only if the waters are safe. Russia's foreign minister in Bahrain this Tuesday, saying it's up to Ukraine to rid the waters of mines, and it's up to the West to lift sanctions.
Therefore, all initiatives that are being voiced now on the topic of food security should be solved, given that the Russian side has long guaranteed everything that depends on us. But the Western countries, which have created a lot of artificial problems by closing their ports to Russian ships, by blocking logistics and financial chains, they should, of course, seriously think about what is more important for them: media attention on the problem of food security, or solve problems with concrete steps. It's up to them.
Dave Keating, I leave you the honor of fact-checking that statement.
Yeah, I mean, this was something that EU leaders were very keen to push back on today. And that's because, actually, when President Zelensky addressed the EU leaders last night, he brought this up. He said, look, Russia's lying about you. Russia's telling the world, and Africa in particular, that the coming food supply crisis is the EU's fault because the EU is blocking these shipments. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, in her statement just tonight at the press conference, was telling people that this is not true, that the EU has no such blocks on the grain export, that this is Russia blocking the export of its own grain, and that it's also blocking Ukraine from exporting grain, and that's the problem here. They discussed this food supply crisis today. They talked about different ways that they can tackle it. The EU is going to hugely increase its export of grain and other foodstuffs that are now missing, but it's going to be difficult. I mean, I think people are really looking toward the next months with quite a lot of trepidation.
Did you just say it, Conway Mouet, that Russian narrative is working?
It is indeed. I mean, there is a war on the ground, but there is an information war as well. And I think, we can see the effect of it in Africa. I mean, we've seen it in Mali, and France, knows very well how Wagner is operating. And now, having visited a few African countries in the past few weeks, I see that this propaganda is working well in kind of anti-colonial, anti-French propaganda, very popular among the young population. And also to say that this war where Ukraine is the victim, I mean, Ukraine didn't invite an aggression of its territories. It is suffering today an invasion that it was started by, not Russia, by Vladimir Putin. I think we have to separate the Russian people and what the Kremlin has decided to do, because the sanctions are against the decision of the aggression, not against Russia as a country. And the West is not at war with Russia. I think we need to make that very clear and repeat it. But what struck me is that in the vote, there's some symbolic things, but they are important. In the last UN vote, a lot of African countries abstained from condemning Russia as aggression of Ukraine. So, so what is working on the ground among the population, the public opinion, is also reflected in the positions that are taken by the African leaders. And of course, a lot of them have also food problem because of climate change. In the Burkina Faso, they're expecting a famine, for instance.
Right.
And so the cutting back on, the grains not arriving in the ports is, enhancing the suffering of the populations. Between
Ukraine and Russia, it's 30% of the foods that's exported to the developing world. It goes to 50% if you're talking about the World Food Program, the UN's food agency. So Thierry Brosse, you have, as we've discussed amply during this show, the EU accepting to inflict pain upon itself with a Russian oil embargo. You heard Dave Keating describe Russia willing to accept pain upon itself by blocking the export of its own foodstuffs out of the Black Sea. So I'll ask the question I asked you again. When you look at, can you establish the parallel, and do sanctions work? In this case, it's Russia imposing sanctions.
Yes, I mean, retaliation is working. I mean, they are retaliating against us. As I stated, I mean, today, tomorrow are going to see two countries not getting their Russian gas any longer. And this is retaliation from this. So yes, but I think the concept of sanction, if we go back to the concept of sanction, it is to hurt the other party more than yourself. And so this is how we have to measure this. Are we hurting Russia more than we are hurting our people? Yes, we are going to inflict pain on our people. And that's also what we have to say. We are going to say higher prices in energy, higher prices in food. It's not my domain, but this is the reality. And so the question is, what we want to achieve is a change at the Kremlin level, if I'm right. And so therefore the question, is this working? I mean, if you do the math, $200 million less in terms of oil, that's something like 10% of the cost of the war on the Russian side, if I do broad math. If we manage to get this gas, that's another 10%. And this is way more than the $8 million we were getting. We've reduced the coal money from Russia. So I think we are on this path. It takes longer than than perhaps Ukraine is expecting, but we also are suffering. I mean, I think
suffering, but not as much.
We are suffering, but not as much. That's good sanction, I would say.
Peter Zamayev, you agree?
Yes, I would agree so. You know, Russia is obviously once again playing, trying to, act all macho and to bluff and to pretend that it's, nothing really it gets to it. But, at the end of the day, it will. And the sanctions will also hurt. But once again, I think it's the military that needs to, the military, successes by Ukraine that will, shift Putin's calculation. And in this light, I'll just like to add on this note of concern that we have been watching this phone diplomacy that Chancellor Scholz and President Macron have engaged in with Vladimir Putin for several hours. We don't understand what could be discussed in these several hours.
Well, one of the things, Peter, that's being discussed is, and there's a UN delegation in Moscow today, is opening up the Black Sea. If there's success on that front, wouldn't that be win-win?
I'm very skeptical on this front. Vladimir Putin made it clear that he would do this in exchange for lifting sanctions precisely. I think Europe needs to consider whether it needs to, accept Vladimir Putin's bluff and meet it with a bluff of its own. We have, I would actually suggest that Europe considers as some kind of an escort, a humanitarian escort that would go and actually, try to take this grain and have Russia then decide whether it would, launch missiles at such an escort. I think once again, Vladimir Putin is bluffing, and Europe needs to really step up to Vladimir Putin.
And then, Conway, right now there are French troops deployed to Romania. And if we again call up that map, we see Romania is one of those countries that borders the Black Sea. Is that something that you espouse, that eventually French naval vessels accompany the export of Ukrainian ships? Let me put it to Hélène Conway-Mouret.
The positioning of French troops in Romania, I think it's part of what we have done, what the Americans have done, to reinforce a lot of the country's military activities, if you like. So I think it will be a good move if indeed we could get some of the grain to start with, because Ukrainian farmers need to also get paid for what they do. They work hard, and it is important that their crops do not rot on the ground.
How do you think Moscow would react?
While other populations are suffering a famine, So I mean, we need to kind of have a humanitarian also, I think, outlook on all of that. But I think it will have to be part of an overall agreement. Because at the end
and
of the day...
is that an agreement at the level of the EU or at the level of NATO or at the level of the United Nations?
No, I think the United Nations. I mean, NATO is a military organization, okay? The United Nations have a look over, the entire world and, can make decisions, but it has to be at that level. And I think at the end of the day, there is a war, but the war will end. And while I understand the frustration about, phone conversations between various presidents and Vladimir Putin, at the end of the day, Vladimir Putin will have to sit down with President Zelensky at the table, and it will have to be an agreement, because the war, it's not going to be Afghanistan or one of these wars, that never ends. And when it ends badly. I think we have to kind of, for the sake of the civilian populations, the Ukrainian population and the rest of Europe, we need to find ways of bringing Vladimir Putin, who is the only person responsible for this war, and it has to be repeated, and we have to counter the Russian propaganda that it's not the West that is against, what is happening, and certainly not responsible for what is happening in Ukraine.
Peter Zamayev, do you understand the senator's position?
I understand the Senate's position, but I think that, we've already sat down, the West has sat down with Putin on numerous occasions, including with the, help of your former President Sarkozy in 2008 in Georgia. And all it did is establish a new status quo, ratify a land grab and embolden Vladimir Putin to go on and do other crazy things all the way up to the invasion of the biggest land-based war in Europe's post-war history. And let me just add to this, the deblockading idea. I'm not advocating a direct military confrontation between the West and Russia, but for example, enabling Ukraine to deblockade on its own would actually assist in the process of persuading Putin diplomatically to do it. And I think Denmark made a very, very courageous move. It gave Ukraine anti-ship harpoon missiles. And very soon Ukraine will be able to deblockade on its own. And that's when diplomacy will actually have a chance to work.
Yeah, for the Ukrainians right now, the morale blow of those heavy casualties we were describing in the Donbass, at least partly offset by the knowledge that more Western military aid like those Harpoon missiles is pouring in. But there are limits to how far that military aid will go.
Are you going to send long-range rocket systems to Ukraine?
We're not going to send to Ukraine rocket systems that can strike into Russia.
We're not going to send rocket systems that can strike into Russia. Dave Keating, your thoughts on those remarks by Joe Biden?
I think that reflects a lot what we're hearing in the EU as well, as they have this unprecedented EU military aid to a country at war. The equipment should be defensive. That's the general rubric, let's say. And of course, it's very hard to discern what is defensive military equipment and what is offensive military equipment, because sometimes you need to be offensive to be defensive. But that is the general principle. And I think the fear is that if you cross a line into providing Ukraine weapons that are seen as offensive into Russia, obviously Ukraine presents no threat of invasion of Russia or anything like that. But there is a fine line here between NATO aiding a country that is at war with Russia and being at war with Russia itself. And that's the squeamishness that we have around this right now.
And the Harpoon missiles, how do they fit in?
I mean, I think, as I understand it, the White House walked that back a bit. So I'm actually myself a little confused about where the U.S. stands, particularly on that type of military equipment. Maybe some of the other panelists know, but I think that probably what happened there is Biden was speaking off the cuff and reflecting the general sentiment. But in terms of how that ended up, I'm not actually sure.
And then, Conway Mouret, they have high inflation in America too. Do you sense that the United States, which is the big player in NATO, is perhaps rethinking right now how they proceed as we dig in again for a long war?
I find that there is a kind of discrepancy between what Congress wants, that are more kind of into a long war and escalation. I mean, some of our colleagues from Congress have kind of told us we have to brace ourselves for a nuclear war in Europe, and be prepared for it. And that's not what the White House thinking seems to be about. I do not think that they want an escalation that will actually, put Vladimir Putin in a corner, that he will actually start going into a dirty war using chemical warfare and, these type of things. So I think it is a signal by the American president that they do not wish to have an escalation in that war, and that we're doing our best to support Ukraine. And indeed, it is working, and the country is showing a resistance that nobody anticipated. And I think Vladimir Putin, was the first one not to think that it was going to turn out the way it is turning out. So I think it is in our common interest that we do not escalate, because I think, having sanctions and a high price at, putting petrol in one's car or having to cope with nuclear warfare, I think it's quite different.
All right. Much more to talk about on this issue. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Hélène Conway-Mouret, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank Thierry Brosse, Peter Zalmayev for being with us from Kyiv, Dave Keating in Brussels. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.